Okay, so now we're going to talk about the female reproductive system. So we're going to be talking about those hormones again, and now we're going to be talking about it from the perspective of the female. This is part 2 of chapter 26. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff going on here, but we kind of have to understand the anatomy before we can really kind of piece together a lot of stuff. And there's a little bit more to the anatomy of a female than there is a male. Um, and so whereas the sperm were developed in the testes, in a female, the oocyte, or what we usually call the egg, and I a lot of times use those interchangeably, even though they're not the same thing, um, but that's kind of what we call it. But it's the oocyte. So the oocytes are really formed in the ovaries, which are sitting here, and then we have the fimbriae, which are surrounding the ovaries. And those are attached directly to the fallopian tubes or the uterine tubes. And so the oocyte, if you can imagine this, after it's released during ovulation, moves down the fallopian tube. And then if it's fertilized, it will implant in the uterus. Okay? And then that's where it will grow and develop. Now, it can only grow and develop there if an endometrial lining that we'll talk about is there, and that's the blood and tissue that will support it. And so if there is no fertilization, then that is excreted as menses or your period. And if the egg is fertilized, then it will go on to nourish that egg and it will grow. Okay, so site of ovary is the site of egg development. Fertilization, sperm from the penis is deposited into the vagina. So let's think about what happens there. So if we look, this is the vagina down here, and this is something called the cervix. So cervix means neck. Okay, and that is the opening from the vagina into the uterus. Now, usually this is filled with thick mucus, and so there is no movement. Okay, so something can't get in there. However, during just before ovulation, this mucus will thin, and then if sperm is deposited, the sperm will move in and it will travel, it will swim, quite literally, up, and it will look to see if there is an oocyte or an egg waiting for it. Or it might move up and it might just live in there for a few days, waiting for an egg to come out. And then when the egg comes out, it will fertilize that egg, and then that fertilized egg will move down and again implant in the endometrial lining on the uterus if if uh, if it's fertilized. Okay, so sperm from the penis deposited into the vagina, moved through the cervix, through the uterus, and then up into the uterine tube or the fallopian tubes. Okay, so that's usually, and this is important, that's usually where fertilization takes place. So fertilization usually takes place up here in the fallopian tube. Okay, now, also, the cervix dilates during birth as the baby pushes down. So when we talk about how you're dilated 6 centimeters or 4 centimeters or 10 centimeters, that's usually when it's ready to come. That's what's happening is the cervix will push apart because the baby's growing in there and is pushing down on it. And contractions of the uterus, this is a very muscular organ, are pushing also to push that baby out, and so the cervix will become more and more dilated, and then it's able to move. Then it's able to move through. Okay, so in the same way that we talked about spermatogenesis, we're going to talk about oogenesis. The biggest difference is this right here. Meiosis begins prior to birth. Okay, it begins prior to birth in females, whereas in males it took 65 days for sperm to develop. In females it takes years, but not because of what you think. It starts in the fetal period. Yes, you have determined you have all of the eggs you're ever going to have. However, that's about anywhere from 200,000 to 2 million. That is more than enough. Okay, so that's where it all begins. You have these dedicated oocytes that are going to become the follicles that we're going to talk about. And then it just kind of stops for a while during childhood. There is no more development. They just kind of live in the ovaries just waiting. And then at puberty, they begin to develop again. And these oocytes will form something called a follicle, which is simply a the oocyte with a bunch of cells around it. Okay? So these cells around that are surrounding that oocyte are going to produce things like estrogen and progesterone. Okay? All right, and so as they get larger and larger, they produce more and more estrogen and progesterone until ovulation. And ovulation is when the oocyte actually moves out, and then only after it is, and this is very strange, only after this oocyte is fertilized does meiosis actually complete. Okay? So remember, in the sperm, it happened all at once. It just was one long process that takes a couple of months and it's done. In females, even though it begins in the fetal period, it doesn't really start to develop again until puberty, and then it only completes if fertilization takes place. Okay, so I put down here, so if we look at the numbers, you still have, so even though you made 200,000 to 2 million at birth, that's how many you had, at puberty you still have about 40,000 remaining. The others degenerate, and then those 40,000, only about 400 will mature during a lifetime. So you have plenty left. You don't run out of eggs. That's not why you go through menopause. You go through menopause, it's a hormonal process, and it stops. The ovaries actually stop producing the eggs. They stop moving them out. What causes that is still being studied, but that's what happens. Okay, so since we have two different things going on here, we have two different cycles to think about. We have the ovarian cycle. What's going on with this? We're going to start calling it a follicle. Okay, so even though we talk about the oocyte, we're going to start calling it a follicle because the follicle has these other cells that are surrounding it, these thecal cells that are surrounding it, and those are supposed to be cells. Looks a little scary. Um, and so we're going to start talking about how that happens. And the follicle actually develops as part of the ovarian cycle. Okay? The uterine cycle, what's going on is you're building up something called the endometrial lining, which is what I mentioned before. That's this layer of blood and tissue that's there to nourish a fertilized egg. Okay? So it can survive in there. So these are both cyclical, but they absolutely work together. I mean, there's constant feedback between these, and so as the follicle is developing, and then when ovulation takes place, and then this is going to cause the buildup of the endometrial lining, and then if no fertilization takes place after about a month, then this will shed. This endometrial lining will shed, and that's what menses is. Okay, and then both cycles, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle, start over. You start developing another follicle, and you start building up a new endometrial lining. However, we're going to talk about them separately because we have to understand what is going on in both. But probably more importantly, we have to understand what's going on in the ovaries. Okay, so these are these cells I was talking about, the granulosa cells and the thecal cells, okay, that are surrounding. So what you're seeing here is a blow up of one of these follicles. So this is a follicle. Okay, and I don't care if you know if it's secondary, primary. They've named them because of the different stages that they are, but all you need to know is that they are developing. They start out very, very small and they grow. Okay, they get larger and larger. And the whole time, these cells that are surrounding it are producing progesterone and estrogen. Okay, why is that important? Because then as it gets really, really large, they start producing more and more progesterone and estrogen. So it may start out with a moderate amount, and then towards ovulation, it really increases. Okay, so 3 phases. There's the follicular phase, because we haven't even looked at this yellow stuff down here yet. There's the follicular phase, and the follicular phase takes about 10 days. It varies, okay? And so what causes that to happen? Do you remember from the males? FSH. And it makes complete sense. follicle stimulating hormone. A slight increase in follicle stimulating hormone will tell follicles to start to develop. And there's a process, and we don't know what causes this process, but after the FSH says, hey, start developing, one will become the main follicle, and it's the one that's going to go on to develop. And so it develops over a while, about 10 days, and then once it's matured completely, we see here, this is a mature follicle. Okay, once it's matured completely, then that oocyte will pop out. Okay, and that is ovulation, which is the second phase. Okay, so number 2 is ovulation. The ripened follicle or mature follicle bursts, and that releases the oocyte. And when it bursts, it actually releases prostaglandins. It's actually an inflammatory response, and so it causes temperature to rise. Lots of things can happen during this phase. And so it can even be painful in some people. Okay, but it's often something that can be felt. Okay, so not always. So it's important. I mention this here because, and I'm going to mention it several times because this is like one of the most important things to keep in mind is that what causes that ovulation? What causes ovulation? What triggers this oocyte to move out? And that is luteinizing hormone. Okay, so remember in males, luteinizing hormone was activating Leydig cells to tell them to make testosterone. Well, in females, luteinizing hormone causes this oocyte to move out. Okay, ovulation. It causes ovulation. Okay, so it's called luteinizing hormone because now we move on to the third phase, which is the luteal phase. In the luteal phase, okay, there are a couple of things to remember. First of all, this oocyte, we don't know if it's going to be fertilized. Okay, there may be sperm there, there may not be sperm there. So we don't know. And so what happens is after that oocyte is released, you produce this follicle turns into the corpus luteum. That's why it's called luteinizing hormone, because it causes ovulation, but it also causes this follicle to turn into the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is going to produce a whole lot of progesterone. Okay? So the corpus luteum is making a lot of progesterone. Progesterone was being made previously, but estrogen was mainly the important hormone during the follicular phase. So estrogen was important here. Progesterone is more important in the luteal phase. What progesterone does is it keeps that endometrial lining thick. Okay? It keeps it thick. It keeps it makes it ready for a baby to grow. Okay? So if there is a pregnancy and this oocyte is fertilized, then you want to maintain that endometrial lining. Okay, so it'll implant on there, and then the progesterone will continue to, which is being released from the corpus luteum, will keep that endometrial lining thick. Okay, so if fertilization takes place, we want that to stay around, right? We want this corpus luteum to stay there if you're pregnant. However, if there isn't a signal back, because this corpus luteum doesn't know, it's sitting up here in the ovary. It doesn't know what's going on in the uterus. So there has to be a signal that says, hey, yes, I'm pregnant. And then if this signal comes, it's something called human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG. So this signal will come back and it will say, hey, yes, I'm pregnant. And once the corpus luteum gets that signal, it says, okay, I'm staying. I am going to stay here, and I am going to make sure that I produce the proper hormones to nurture this endometrial lining and make sure that this baby survives. Okay. However, if there is no signal, just crickets, no signal, no signal, no signal, then this will regress and degenerate and go away. And that means that your progesterone levels, while they were very high, will drop. Okay, and when they drop, that's what causes menses. So if there's no fertilization, this corpus luteum deteriorates. It goes away. Okay, and when it goes away and stops producing its hormones, it's going to cause the endometrial lining to go away as well. Okay, so let's kind of look at these hormones. Okay, so there are a few things going on. So first of all, this is our ovarian cycle here. Okay, it's our ovarian cycle, and so we can see that we have a small follicle here, and then the follicle continues to grow and develop until it is a mature follicle. Okay, and then there's ovulation, where the oocyte comes out, and then we form this corpus luteum. So that's the ovarian cycle that we just talked about. But what's going on with the hormones? So we mentioned that the cells, the cells surrounding the developing follicle, are producing estrogen and progesterone. Okay, and so they, as it gets larger and larger, what tends to happen is the estrogen levels will increase. And then right before ovulation, actually, it will start to decrease. The estrogen levels start to decrease. Okay, something really interesting is going on, and this is so important for so many reasons. Because estrogen and progesterone are being produced, what they're doing is they're feeding back. So it's a negative feedback mechanism saying, hey, LH, and hey, FSH, you're good. You don't need to increase, you just need to stay at a nice low level. Okay, because we've got everything under control, we have a follicle that is developing, and so it keeps these at a pretty constant level most of the time. Okay, and then, so that's negative feedback, and then something very, very strange happens. Around here, when the estrogen levels get pretty high, okay, when they start to increase, all of a sudden estrogen becomes positive feedback. So whereas it was saying no luteinizing hormone, don't come out of the anterior pituitary gland, at some point it says, okay, I'm demanding LH that you increase many, many fold. Okay, so you really increase, and we call that an LH surge. Okay. Okay. So whereas estrogen and progesterone were keeping LH at a low level, all of a sudden, towards the end of this part of the cycle, this proliferative or follicular phase, towards the end of that cycle, it actually causes positive feedback and your luteinizing hormone surges. And when your luteinizing hormone surges, that's what I mentioned last time, that's what causes ovulation. Okay, so it's that surge in luteinizing hormone that causes ovulation. Now you can see that FSH also starts to increase. Okay, so there's also an increase in FSH, but remember that other hormone called inhibin? Inhibin will actually cut that off. Okay, and it'll say, nope, this isn't about you. This is all about LH. We're trying to increase LH, not FSH. And so the LH is allowed to surge, causes ovulation. And then we move to the corpus luteum, or the luteal phase. And then this follicle, after it loses the oocyte, will form the corpus luteum, which is producing, see, we can see here, now we're producing lots of progesterone. So I kind of mentioned that earlier, that really the important player in the follicular phase, in the first half of the cycle, is estrogen. Okay? The important hormone for the second part, or actually technically the third part, if you include ovulation as the second, but the luteal phase, the important part for that is progesterone. Okay, so progesterone becomes more important now. Okay, so the surge of LH induces ovulation. The surge of LH also causes a developing follicle to change, creating the corpus luteum, which is what we see here. Okay. We haven't talked about the uterine cycle, but this is a nice graph to kind of introduce what's going on there. While the estrogen is being produced, the endometrial lining on the lining of the uterus is getting larger and larger, more and more and more. Okay, and then after ovulation, it actually, so it's proliferating, so we call that proliferating here. But after ovulation, it actually starts to secrete growth factors. It starts to secrete some hormones that we'll discuss, or we may not. And it's producing it instead of just being closed vessels, it's actually leaking and it's actually causing stuff to move out. And so we say that it becomes secretory. Okay. Now, if there was a developing baby there, then it would be nourishing that. But if not, then it's just reabsorbed. Okay. So that gets us to the uterine phase. All right, so or the uterine cycle. So the uterine cycle is often associated with the menstrual cycle. Okay, so we can see that when we talk about the uterine cycle or the menstrual cycle, it always starts with menses because that's something we can see, and that's the period. Okay, so that's always the first day of the cycle, the first day of the cycle. So we can see that that's what day one is, and that's the sloughing off of the endometrial lining from the wall of the uterus. And so that takes a few days. And then we have this proliferative phase. So let's think about what was causing the proliferation, because this is where the uterine cycle and the ovarian cycle kind of work together. Okay, so we had the release of FSH, which said, hey, follicle, start developing. The follicle starts to develop. It's producing estrogen. Estrogen is saying, hey, build up the endometrial lining. We've got an egg coming. Okay, so the endometrial lining builds up, and then we have our LH surge. Okay, so the estrogen is increasing, the LH surge occurs, ovulation takes place, and then we have the corpus luteum. So now we have the corpus luteum, which is making estrogen and progesterone as well, but now it's making more progesterone. Okay, so the progesterone is saying, all right, we call it the secretory phase. This is saying, okay, we are going to maintain this. We are going to make this endometrial lining something in which or on which a fertilized oocyte can survive. Okay, so that's the corpus luteum that's doing that. So you can kind of see how the ovarian cycle, stimulated by follicle stimulating hormone, to develop this, or mature the follicle, and then the luteinizing hormone, or the LH surge, causes ovulation, and then we have the luteum. You can kind of see how these things are working together with the uterine cycle. Okay, so we have the first day, which is menses, and then we have the proliferative phase, okay, or the follicular phase if we're talking about the ovarian cycle. So the proliferative phase, the endometrium proliferates, and while the follicle is maturing. So this particular part, if you're female, you might find this interesting. If you're male, you should probably know this too. But the first part of the cycle actually varies. Okay, so when ovulation takes place, this is the part that generally varies. Okay, this first part before ovulation. But it's usually about 10 days, something like that. Everybody's a little bit different. And then after ovulation, we have the secretory phase, if we're talking about the uterine cycle, secretory phase, or the luteal phase, if we're talking about the ovarian cycle. And that's the maturation, secretion of uterine glands, presence of the corpus luteum. And this is actually very consistent. So after ovulation takes place, this part of the cycle is pretty consistent. You can pretty much guess, depending on your own particular cycle, you can pretty much guess how long it's going to be until menses takes place, if you know exactly when ovulation takes place. And that's, not always easy to know. Okay, so the uterine cycle, again, estrogen is primarily responsible for building up the endometrium. We've mentioned that. Progesterone is primarily responsible for maintaining the endometrium and making it secretory. We've mentioned that. Okay. So, and I mentioned the endometrium secretes hormones and other factors to support the fertilized oocyte. So this is the same picture we looked at earlier. However, it kind of shows what's going on. So it shows that this is the egg. So if we look at this picture up here, we can see that the egg is moved down, and if it's fertilized, it will build up, and this is the endometrial lining. We can kind of see the endometrium on the inside of the uterus here building up, and there. And so it will nourish and provide an environment that allows that fertilized oocyte to develop. Okay, so putting it all together. So let's go back over everything one at a time. GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, is released from the hypothalamus. Okay, I don't have that written up here, but it's released from the hypothalamus, and it stimulates FSH and LH to be released from the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland. Remember FSH, this should make perfect sense now, stimulates ovarian follicles to develop. It's called follicle stimulating hormone, and it causes ovarian follicles to develop. Okay, and then one of those will take over as a primary follicle. And I might want to say that you have two ovaries if you're female. There are two ovaries, and so this might switch. You know, 1 month it might be this one, the left ovary. 1 month it might be the right ovary. It might be the right ovary 2 times in a row. Sometimes people have a dominant ovary where it's the same ovary several times. Okay, but it does vary. It doesn't just go back and forth, but it can both could it's very uncommon, but it does happen where both will ovulate at the same time, and anything is possible. Okay. Estrogen and progesterone increase, so we have follicle stimulating hormone that's caused the follicle to start developing, and then estrogen and progesterone increase, which keeps the FSH and LH low. I just want to say something about that really quickly. It's estrogen and progesterone, mainly estrogen, that keeps the FSH and the LH low due to that negative feedback. This is why hormonal birth controls work. This is one of the big reasons why hormonal birth controls work, because they will actually stop the FSH or keep it at low levels consistently. Okay, there isn't a big rise in estrogen, because the follicle will not develop. It's keeping this FSH low. So the follicle isn't developing. And so hormonal birth controls will actually stop ovulation because they won't let this follicle develop. Okay, so then as we mentioned, estrogen reaches a higher level where it suddenly changes to positive feedback and leads to the surge in LH, and LH surge triggers ovulation. Okay, that mature follicle is transformed into a corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum secretes progesterone. Okay, and progesterone triggers and maintains. Triggers isn't always the word. Maintains the endometrial lining. And another thing that progesterone does is it causes thickening of the mucus in the cervical canal. Okay, so progesterone thickens the mucus in the cervical canal. We had a test the other day, and there was a student that sent an email the night before the test saying that she was pregnant and she had lost her mucus plug. So that's what we're talking about, is we're talking about the mucus plug that's blocking anything from moving into, or in some cases out of, the uterus. Okay, so, and also, this is, since we mentioned hormonal birth control, progesterone-only birth controls will cause an increased thickening of that mucus, and that's the main way that they work to prevent pregnancy. Okay, so again, if there's no implantation, the endometrium sloughs off, that's menses, and so the LH and the FSH increase again, because what was making the because when the corpus luteum stops producing estrogen and progesterone, okay, so if there is no implantation, if there is no pregnancy, that corpus luteum never gets the signal. It stops producing estrogen and progesterone, and it releases the LH and the FSH to start another round of follicles. And so that starts the cycle over again, allows those new follicles to start developing. Okay, so fertilization. So again, sperm must move through the cervical canal to the fallopian or uterine tubes, and this shows the mucus plug in place here. And so sperm are unable to move through here, and so no fertilization can take place. So that's what this says. Progesterone promotes a mucus plug that prevents sperm from moving. And when fertilization takes place, the first sperm to penetrate causes a reaction that blocks the rest. So once a sperm makes it through, it will actually depolarize the cell and it will block anybody else from moving in. Okay. There are some other things that they're finding out, but they do know that that takes place. There are other molecules that may be involved, but once, even though there are millions of sperm, and of course remember they have their acrosome, which is breaking down this membrane, and even though there are millions of them that are all trying to get onto it or into it, once one makes it through, it immediately depolarizes that cell and says, nope, no more. Okay, or that's the plan anyway. Okay. Um, okay. So only the head enters, which is why you have your mom's mitochondria. The mitochondria was in here, and that mitochondria will go on to become the next organism. Okay. All right. Pregnancy. The oocyte, and this doesn't vary. Oocytes can be fertilized for up to 24 hours after ovulation. That means this oocyte can move out and just kind of sit there wandering and waiting, and it can survive for about 24 hours waiting for a sperm to fertilize it. However, what tends to happen, sperm cells can be viable for as much as 6 days. It's usually about 2 to 4, but most things that you will read will give the maximum amount because they want people to be careful. Okay, so they say, oh, you need to be very, very careful. You shouldn't have sex for a long time um, before ovulation because these sperm can live in there for a long time. And like I said, it's usually a couple of days, but it can be as much as 6. Okay, so the sperm can wait, and then the oocyte can, once ovulation occurs, it moves this. There are cilia. There are cilia that will move this oocyte down, and then you will have implantation. Okay, and once you have implantation, so you can see that the the endometrial lining, which is building up here, will then have to nurture that baby, that developing baby. Okay, so the baby forms its own sac. Okay, and I have here an ectopic pregnancy is when implantation occurs anywhere else besides the uterine cavity. This is where we want it to happen. Okay, so the baby has to live in here. The endometrial lining is here, so the baby makes a sac. Okay, two parts of that I want to talk about are the chorion and the amnion. The chorion is, you can see here, it's this outer sac, okay, out here, and then the amnion is more of this inner sac. Okay? So that's what this is pointing to here. So these two sacs are how the baby will interact with the environment. So the chorion, and this is important. I have a close up in the next picture, but it's nice to have an outside view of it. This chorion is all out here. Okay. Now it does not. So you can kind of see how it kind of moves out here, and it's going to interact with, but not directly, the endometrial lining. Remember, the endometrial lining is now secreting things. It's secreting growth factors. It's giving oxygen and glucose and ions and everything that that baby needs to survive. Um, and so if we take a close-up look at this, we can see this is the chorion here. Okay, so we have these things called chorionic villi. And so these are the chorionic villi. And you can see, and this is very important, mom and baby have separate circulatory system. Baby has its own heart. It's got its own circulatory system. It has its own vessels. And so it's pumping blood through here. And mom, all she's doing is stuff that is in her blood is oozing out and being secreted into this environment. And so things like oxygen will just move across that membrane. Antibodies, small antibodies, not large antibodies. Large antibodies, like what you would find against like the A and B blood types, don't move through, but the one for Rh does move through. And things for like the flu and a cold or something like that, those will also move in and be absorbed by the baby's circulatory system. Okay, and that's because of this chorion that's produced. Okay, the amnion is the inner layer, and it's making the fluid, the amniotic fluid that the baby is swimming around in. Okay, so um, one other thing that's very important is this last point here. Human chorionic gonadotropin is released from the chorion. If you think about it, the chorion is being made to house the baby, to hold the baby, to protect the baby from, or not protect, but to separate the baby from the mom. And so if the hormone, do you remember earlier when we were talking about in the ovary, there's the corpus luteum that's just sort of sitting there waiting for a signal. It doesn't know. It's saying, are we pregnant? Are we pregnant? The chorion will actually produce that, and I mentioned it earlier, the HCG, which will go up here and says, yes, we're pregnant. We are pregnant. Okay, no more questions. We also use that as a pregnancy test, and it's a very reliable pregnancy test because what's producing it? The very sac that's surrounding a baby. When is that sac going to be there? When there's a baby there. So it's actually a pretty reliable pregnancy test. Okay, so putting it all together, I know I've mentioned this many, many times, but I just going to go through it quickly one more time. You have the ovarian cycle, which you have the follicular phase here, which it's producing estrogen and progesterone to a lesser extent. The estrogen increases at some points, becomes positive feedback, causes the luteinizing hormone to surge, the LH surge, which causes ovulation. You have the corpus luteum. And then what was going on in the uterine cycle? It started with menses, and then there was the proliferative phase. So as the estrogen was increasing, the endometrium was proliferating, and then it turned secretory, which was led by the progesterone. Okay. Now this also adds basal body temperature, and you can see at ovulation the temperature will increase. Okay. And a lot of people use that to sort of guess when they are fertile. Okay, and if pregnancy occurs, the HCG is released from the chorionic sac, which sends a signal to the corpus luteum saying, hey, we're pregnant. Yay. All right. So that keeps it around. Okay. So this is another graph that shows after pregnancy that this is the HCG, which you can see that it increases and then it starts to fall off after a while. But here's something that's important. Okay. Estrogen and progesterone increases a lot, and then estrogen starts to increase as well. Okay, and they both increase right up until birth, and then they just plummet. They just fall off. Okay, that's actually pretty important because the only reason that during that entire time the breasts were developing and the high estrogen levels kept the breasts from producing milk. Okay, kept the breast from producing prolactin, which is what's going to cause them to produce and make milk. And so during that time, there are these things called alveolus. I know we talk about alveoli in the lungs, but alveolus is more refers to shape than actually what it is, so it gets that name a lot. But there are alveoli that are in the breast that start to develop during the entire time of pregnancy, and those are they're specialized cells that are able to produce milk. Okay, so they put the milk in these little chambers, and then those chambers are either the milk is allowed to be expressed or it isn't. Now, during pregnancy, it's not allowed to be expressed because of the high levels of estrogen. Okay, but then after birth, when the estrogen levels drop, all of a sudden that is released. Okay, and so the prolactin can be activated, and then the breasts will start to produce and express milk. Now, there's something called the letdown reflex. Okay, which is where the milk is actually allowed to move out, and then and that is actually triggered by lots of things. Oxytocin is the hormone that triggers it, but what causes the release of oxytocin can be anything from suckling to hearing a baby cry or anything like that. Okay, so that's it, and you have a baby and you have a way to take care of the baby. So that pretty much covers reproduction.